Some men spend their entire lives learning fear. Others discover it in a single second, standing over the wrong woman. The first shot shattered a champagne glass in Zaria Brooks's hand at exactly 9:17 p.m. Crystal exploded across the white tablecloth like falling ice, and for one suspended moment, nobody inside Bellarosa Jazz Lounge moved. Not the men in $1,000 suits gathered beneath the amber chandeliers. Not the violinist frozen mid-note near the stage. Not even the waiters carrying silver trays through the crowded Manhattan dining room. Every eye turned toward the young black waitress standing beside table 12, her dark uniform stained with red wine dripping slowly onto the marble floor. Zaria swayed once before catching herself against the edge of the table, her breathing shallow, her expression stunned more than frightened, as though her mind still hadn't accepted what had just happened. Across the room, a woman screamed. A chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Someone shouted for security. But over all the panic came another sound far more dangerous than gunfire. Silence. The kind of silence powerful men created when they realized something irreversible had happened. Vincent Hale lowered his hand slowly beneath the table, his expensive watch glinting beneath the restaurant lights. His face had lost all color. Because the terrified waitress standing in front of him wasn't supposed to matter. 5 minutes earlier, she'd only been another invisible girl carrying drinks through crowded aisles while rich people ignored her existence. Another hard-working woman from Brooklyn trying to survive Manhattan rent prices and double shifts. That was all Vincent Hale thought she was when his younger sister Nina laughed at her accent. That was all he thought when his friends made jokes about girls from her neighborhood. That was all he thought when Zaria apologized softly for the wine Nina had deliberately knocked from the tray. She never argued. Never raised her voice. Never gave them the satisfaction of seeing anger in her eyes. And maybe that was what made cruel people even crueler. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Nina snapped earlier. That night, snapping her fingers inches from Zaria's face while the table laughed over expensive bourbon and cigar smoke. Zaria had lifted her eyes calmly then. Steady. Quiet. Dignified. "Yes, ma'am," she answered. Vincent should have noticed the diamond ring hidden beneath the thin silver chain around her neck. He should have noticed the two men near the entrance watching the room too carefully to be ordinary customers. He should have noticed how every manager inside Bellarosa became nervous the second a black Escalade parked outside 30 minutes earlier. But arrogant men rarely notice danger until it arrived wearing grief. Now Zaria's knees finally buckled. A nearby waiter lunged forward, catching her before she hit the marble floor completely. Her trembling fingers curled weakly around his sleeve as the violin music died entirely. "Call an ambulance," someone whispered. "Now." Vincent stood abruptly from his seat, panic replacing the confidence he wore like cologne. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered under his breath, though nobody seemed to hear him. Nobody except the older man seated near the back corner booth. The man who slowly removed his reading glasses before rising to his feet with terrifying calm. Gray-haired. Broad-shouldered. Tailored black overcoat. One of the oldest capos in New York. And when his cold eyes landed on the silver chain around Zaria's neck, his expression changed instantly. The entire restaurant watched him go pale. "God help you," the old man said quietly, staring directly at Vincent Hale. "Do you even know whose fiancé that is?" And then the front doors opened. 3 days earlier, Zaria Brooks stood alone on the subway platform in Brooklyn with rainwater dripping from the edge of her umbrella and exactly $42 left in her checking account. The downtown train screamed through the station as exhausted commuters brushed past her without a second glance, but Zaria barely noticed them. Her attention stayed fixed on the pharmacy receipt folded tightly in her coat pocket. $618. That was how much her mother's heart medication would cost by Friday morning. The number sat in her chest. Heavier than the cold November air. "You are thinking too loud again," her mother used to tease whenever Zaria got quiet. But lately silence was the only thing keeping her together. Bellarosa Jazz Lounge opened at 5 o'clock every evening, and by 4:30 the entire restaurant smelled like garlic butter, polished wood, and expensive perfume drifting in from Manhattan's upper class. Zarya tied her apron carefully inside the employee locker room while the other waitresses exchanged gossip about celebrities and athletes who reserved private booths upstairs. Nobody paid much attention to her. She preferred it that way. Invisible people survived longer in New York. "You are late again, Brooklyn," Marco, the floor manager, muttered as she stepped onto the restaurant floor. He always called her Brooklyn instead of her real name, though she had worked there nearly 11 months. "Subway delays," Zarya answered softly. Marco rolled his eyes and shoved a tray into her hands. "Table 12 is VIP tonight. Big money. Smile more and do not embarrass me." Zarya nodded once and moved toward the dining room without complaint. The Bellarosa glowed at night like something from an old movie. Amber chandeliers reflected off marble floors while soft jazz drifted through the air smooth as warm honey. Men in tailored suits discussed investments over $1,200 bottles of wine while women draped in diamonds laughed behind manicured hands. It was a world built on money so enormous it no longer looked real. And somewhere inside that world, hidden beneath Zarya's black uniform and silver necklace, rested a diamond ring nobody at Bellarosa had ever seen. She touched it unconsciously while arranging silverware near the bar. "A habit now. A reminder. You should wear it properly," Elijah Moretti told her once 6 months earlier while standing beside the windows of his penthouse overlooking Manhattan. The city lights reflected against his white dress shirt while snow fell silently beyond the glass. "Then everyone would treat me differently," Zarya answered. Elijah studied her for a long moment that night, his sharp gray eyes unreadable. "That is the point." "No," she whispered. Gently. "I need to know somebody would still respect me without your name attached to mine." Most people feared Elijah Moretti before ever meeting him. Newspapers called him untouchable. Rivals called him ruthless. Politicians called him privately after midnight when they needed problems erased quietly. But Zarya knew another version of him entirely. The man who remembered her mother's birthday. The man who sat beside her hospital bed at 3 in the morning after surgery and held coffee cups in tattooed hands because he knew hospitals made her nervous. The man who listened instead of interrupted. That version belonged only to her. Which was exactly why she kept their engagement secret. "You love him?" her coworker Lena asked suddenly while polishing glasses beside her. Zarya blinked, startled. "What?" Lena smirked toward the silver chain around Zarya's neck. "You touch that necklace every 5 minutes like somebody is waiting on the other side of it." Zarya smiled before she could stop herself. "Small. Warm. Real. Maybe someone is." At exactly 6:40 that evening, 3 black SUVs pulled silently to the curb outside Bellarosa Jazz Lounge. And every employee inside the restaurant suddenly stopped talking. The atmosphere inside Bellarosa changed the second the SUVs arrived. It was subtle at first. A pause in conversation near the hostess stand. 2 bartenders suddenly standing straighter. The piano player missing half a note before recovering smoothly. Then came the security detail. 4 men entered first wearing dark tailored coats despite the warmth inside the restaurant, their eyes sweeping every corner with the calm precision of people trained to notice danger before it moved. The dining room quieted instinctively. Wealthy people recognized power even when nobody announced it aloud. Marco nearly sprinted across the floor to greet them, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead with a folded napkin. "Private room upstairs is ready," he said too quickly. One of the guards nodded once. No smile. No wasted movement. Then Vincent Hale stepped through the front entrance beside his younger sister Nina, and the entire energy of the room shifted again. Vincent looked like the kind of man magazines called charming because they had never seen him angry. Expensive charcoal suit. Perfect haircut. Gold watch flashing beneath the restaurant lights. But there was something sharp beneath the polished image, something restless behind his smile that made people lower their eyes without understanding why. Nina Hale followed closely beside him, draped in cream-colored silk and diamonds heavy enough to pay someone's yearly rent. Her laugh reached the dining room before she did. Loud. Performative. The kind of laugh designed to make other people feel smaller. "Well," she announced while removing her gloves dramatically near the hostess stand, "this place is trying very hard to look expensive." A few guests chuckled nervously. Marco forced laughter with them. "Mr. Hale, welcome back to Bellarosa." Vincent barely acknowledged him. His attention drifted slowly across the restaurant before stopping on Zarya near the service station carrying a tray of sparkling water. His eyes lingered 1 second too long. "New waitress?" he asked casually. Marco nodded immediately. "One of our best." Nina glanced toward Zarya and smirked faintly. "Pretty," she said dismissively. In a struggling actress kind of way. More quiet laughter followed. Zarya heard every word while adjusting glasses on her tray, but her expression never changed. Years of customer service had taught her that humiliation often arrived smiling. "Table 12, Marco ordered under his breath as he passed beside her. "And be careful tonight. These people matter." Zarya lifted the tray calmly and crossed the dining room beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. The closer she moved toward Vincent Hale's table, the heavier the atmosphere became. Men seated nearby lowered their voices instinctively. Even the servers avoided eye contact near that section. Bellarosa served celebrities, politicians, athletes, and Wall Street executives every week. But this was different. Fear felt different from admiration. "Good evening," Zarya said gently as she arrived beside the table. "Can I start anyone with sparkling water or wine recommendations?" Vincent leaned back in his chair studying her openly while Nina continued scrolling through her phone. "You from Brooklyn?" he asked suddenly. Zarya nodded once. "Yes, sir." "I knew it," Nina interrupted without looking up. You can always hear it in the voice. One of the men at the table laughed quietly into his bourbon glass. Vincent smiled faintly. "Relax," he said toward Zarya. "My sister thinks Manhattan belongs to her." "Somebody around here has standards," Nina replied coldly before finally raising her eyes toward Zarya. "You should smile more when serving people. Customers tip better when the help looks grateful." The words hung in the air heavier than the jazz music drifting from the stage. Nearby conversations slowed. A young busboy froze beside the wine station pretending not to listen. Zarya felt heat rise behind her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Would anyone care to hear tonight's specials?" Nina laughed softly like she had not even spoken to a person at all. Vincent reached for the wine list without breaking eye contact with Zarya. "You are calm," he observed. "Most people get nervous around us." Zarya offered a small polite smile. "Most people probably know who you are." Something unreadable flickered across Vincent's face then. Interest perhaps. Or suspicion. Before he could answer, one of the guards near the entrance pressed a hand discreetly against his earpiece. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. But across the restaurant, Zarya noticed it immediately. And for the first time all evening, something colder than embarrassment settled into her chest. The longer the night continued, the stranger Bellarosa felt. Music still floated through the restaurant smooth and elegant, servers still carried silver trays between candlelit tables, and wealthy guests still pretended everything was normal, but tension had settled beneath the surface like a storm pressing against glass. Zarya noticed it in the small details first. Vincent Hale checking his watch every few minutes. 2 unfamiliar men lingering near the rear hallway pretending to study the wine shelves. The guard near the entrance whispering into his earpiece more often now. Even Marco had stopped yelling at employees and started wiping already clean counters with nervous hands. "Table 12 wants another bottle," Lena whispered while passing beside Zarya near the service station. And Nina Hale specifically requested you bring it. Zarya exhaled slowly before lifting the wine bottle from the counter. Of course she did. Lena lowered her voice carefully. Those people make me nervous. Me too, Zarya admitted quietly. She crossed the dining room again beneath the amber lights, the polished floor reflecting shadows from crystal chandeliers overhead. At table 12, Nina sat scrolling through photos on her phone while Vincent listened to one of his associates speaking in a hushed voice beside him. The moment Zarya approached, the conversation stopped immediately. Vincent looked up first. Calm. Controlled. But his jaw looked tighter now. Your timing is perfect, he said while Zarya poured wine into Nina's glass. Nina inspected the color before taking a sip. Finally, she muttered. At least somebody here knows how to do one thing correctly. Zarya ignored the comment smoothly and reached for Vincent's glass next. Careful, Nina added suddenly. That suit costs more than your yearly salary. A few men around the table chuckled quietly again. Zarya kept pouring steadily without reacting. The wine bottle never shook in her hand. You are very disciplined, Vincent observed while watching her closely. Most people either flirt too hard or get offended too easily. I am here to work, sir, Zarya answered politely. Nina leaned back in her chair with a sharp smile. That is exactly what people in your position should remember. The words landed harder than she intended because nearby tables heard them too. Zarya felt eyes turning toward her again. Wealthy strangers pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. It was always the same in places like this. Humiliation dressed elegantly somehow made people more comfortable watching it happen. Nina, Vincent said quietly without taking his eyes off Zarya. You are embarrassing the staff. No, Nina replied coolly. I am reminding them where they belong. Silence settled over the table for half a second. Heavy. Ugly. Then one of the men seated beside Vincent laughed awkwardly to break the tension. Come on, he muttered. She is just a waitress. Zarya lowered the wine bottle carefully onto the tray before finally meeting Nina's gaze directly. Calm eyes. Steady voice. Would you like another minute with the menu? She asked softly. That composure irritated Nina more than anger would have. Cruel people wanted visible damage. They wanted lowered heads and trembling voices. Dignity frustrated them. Nina reached toward her wine glass carelessly, then tilted her wrist just enough for dark red wine to spill across the front of Zarya's black uniform. A sharp gasp came from a nearby table. Oh no, Nina said without sounding sorry at all. What a shame. Wine dripped slowly from Zarya's apron onto the marble floor while laughter flickered quietly around the table. Marco froze near the bar looking horrified but too afraid to intervene. Zarya stood motionless for one long second before grabbing a cloth from her tray and calmly dabbing the stain herself. I apologize for the inconvenience, she said gently. Vincent stared at her then with an expression that looked almost conflicted. Because suddenly she no longer resembled someone weak. She looked composed in a way rich people rarely were. Across the restaurant, one of the guards near the entrance suddenly straightened. His hand pressed firmly against his earpiece again. This time his face lost color entirely. Before Zarya could step away from the table, Vincent's phone vibrated sharply against the white linen tablecloth. He answered immediately. Listened. And the controlled expression on his face vanished all at once. What do you mean he is already here? He said quietly. Then his eyes lifted slowly toward the front entrance of Bellarosa Jazz Lounge. The front doors of Bellarosa opened without drama, but every person inside the restaurant felt the change immediately. Conversation slowed table by table like dominoes falling in silence. Even the jazz band near the stage lost rhythm for half a second before recovering awkwardly. Elijah Moretti entered alone. No raised voice. No visible weapon. Just a perfectly tailored black overcoat draped over broad shoulders. And the kind of stillness that made powerful men nervous. Rainwater glimmered briefly on the dark fabric before one of the guards near the entrance rushed forward to take the coat from him. Elijah barely acknowledged the gesture. His gray eyes swept calmly across the restaurant once. That was all it took. Several guests immediately looked down at their plates. Others suddenly became fascinated with their phones. Fear moved quietly in expensive places. Zarya felt it before she even turned around completely. Her heartbeat changed first. Then warmth spread unexpectedly through her chest despite the humiliation still staining her uniform with red wine. Elijah had told her earlier that morning he would be in Philadelphia overnight handling business. "I will call you when I land," he promised over coffee while adjusting the cufflinks on his white dress shirt. Zarya remembered teasing him gently. "You say that every trip. Because you never answer the first call." She smiled despite herself at the memory now. And for one dangerous second standing beside Vincent Hale's table, she forgot to stay invisible. Elijah noticed immediately. Not the spilled wine. Not the frightened staff. Her. His eyes found her across the crowded dining room with terrifying precision. The hardness in his expression softened almost invisibly before returning to stone. Vincent rose slowly from his chair. "Moretti," he greeted carefully, forcing confidence into his voice. Elijah approached the table with measured steps that echoed softly against polished marble floors. "Hale." The two men shook hands briefly without warmth. It looked polite to strangers. It felt like two storms colliding quietly beneath the ocean. Nina recovered first, flashing a polished smile. "Mr. Moretti," she purred. "Nobody told us you were joining dinner." Elijah's attention never shifted toward her. It remained fixed on the wine soaking through Zarya's uniform. "Looks like I arrived during a celebration," he said calmly. The sentence sounded harmless. Somehow it was not. Vincent glanced toward Zarya briefly. "Just an accident." Elijah nodded once. Accidents reveal character. Silence followed. Heavy enough to crush the room beneath it. Zarya lowered her eyes carefully and stepped backward toward the service aisle before anyone noticed the emotion threatening to betray itself across her face. She needed distance immediately. Elijah standing 10 feet away already made her pulse impossible to control. Another second and somebody at that table would notice. She moved quickly toward the kitchen hallway carrying the empty wine bottle against her chest while staff pretended not to stare. Behind her, conversation slowly resumed across Bellarosa though nobody sounded relaxed anymore. "You know him?" Lena whispered urgently the second Zarya reached the service station. Zarya grabbed a clean towel too fast. "Everybody knows him." "No," Lena pressed softly. "I mean the way he looked at you." Before Zarya could answer, shouting erupted near the rear entrance corridor. Not loud. Sharp. Panicked. One of Vincent Hale's men rushed across the dining room toward table 12, his face pale beneath the restaurant lights. He leaned close to Vincent and whispered something quickly into his ear. Zarya watched Vincent's expression darken instantly. "How many?" Vincent demanded quietly. The man answered in another whisper. Elijah turned slightly then, noticing the sudden tension immediately. His instincts missed nothing. Vincent stood abruptly from the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "Everyone stay seated," he barked toward his men. "Nobody moves until we know what is happening." Guests across the restaurant exchanged nervous glances. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered accidentally. Zarya's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She looked toward Elijah instinctively across the dining room at the exact same moment he looked toward her. And then the lights near the rear hallway flickered once before the entire restaurant fell into absolute silence. For one strange second after the lights flickered, Bellarosa Jazz Lounge became perfectly still. The chandeliers dimmed just enough to cast long shadows across white tablecloths and crystal glasses, and every person inside the restaurant seemed to hold the same breath at once. Elijah. Moretti did not move. That was what frightened Vincent Hale most. Other men panicked when danger arrived unexpectedly. Elijah became quieter. Colder. More focused. He turned his head slightly toward the rear hallway where the shouting had started, his expression unreadable beneath the soft amber glow. "Lock the exits," he said calmly to one of his guards. No raised voice. No visible fear. The guard obeyed immediately. Vincent stepped forward sharply. "Nobody locks anything in my meeting." Elijah finally looked at him directly. "Then perhaps you should have chosen a safer location." The sentence landed like a warning hidden inside politeness. Nearby guests began shifting nervously in their seats. A woman near the piano grabbed her husband's arm whispering that they should leave. But nobody moved toward the doors. Because the men guarding those doors already looked prepared for something terrible. Zarya stood frozen beside the service station clutching a clean towel in both hands while her thoughts raced. Every instinct told her this night was turning into something far more dangerous than humiliation at table 12. The guards. The whispers. Vincent's panic. Elijah arriving unexpectedly. None of it felt accidental anymore. "Brooklyn," Marco hissed urgently from behind the bar. "Get to the kitchen." Zarya nodded quickly and turned toward the rear service hallway. At that exact moment one of Vincent Hale's associates burst through the corridor doors looking pale and breathless. "We have a problem," he shouted toward Vincent. The entire dining room reacted at once. Chairs scraped backward. Glasses tipped over. A few guests stood instinctively while others ducked lower into their booths without understanding why fear had suddenly spread through the restaurant like smoke. Elijah's guards moved instantly, positioning themselves throughout the room with controlled precision. Vincent grabbed his associate by the arm. "Talk." "The shipment got intercepted," the man whispered frantically. "Somebody tipped them off." Vincent's face darkened with fury. "Who?" "We do not know yet." Then somewhere outside the restaurant came the sharp sound of tires screeching against wet pavement. Zarya flinched instinctively. So did half the room. Nina Hale rose from her chair now visibly shaken beneath her polished exterior. "Vincent," she whispered, "tell me this is not happening here." Before he could answer, another loud sound echoed from outside followed by screaming somewhere beyond the restaurant windows. Panic finally cracked the illusion of elegance completely. Guests rushed toward corners of the dining room while servers abandoned trays onto tables. Crystal shattered across marble floors. The violinist disappeared beneath the stage curtains. "Everybody stay down," one of Elijah's men ordered firmly. Zarya's pulse hammered painfully against her ribs as she moved toward the kitchen corridor with several other employees. But halfway there, she stopped suddenly. A little boy stood crying alone beside table 9, separated from his parents in the chaos. No older than 6. Tiny hands covering his ears while terrified adults pushed past him without noticing. Zarya did not think. She moved immediately toward him. "Hey," she whispered gently while kneeling beside the child. "You are okay. Come with me." The boy grabbed her sleeve tightly. Across the dining room Elijah saw her instantly. Even surrounded by chaos, his eyes tracked her movements with frightening accuracy. He watched her shield the child with her own body while guiding him toward the service hallway. And for one brief moment something emotional flickered beneath his controlled expression. Pride perhaps. Or fear. Then everything changed at once. A sharp cracking sound exploded near the front windows. Guests screamed. Several people dropped to the floor instinctively. Zarya turned halfway toward the sound while still holding the little boy close against her side. The child started crying harder now. Elijah moved fast for the first time all night. "Zarya," he shouted. Her name. Loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Every head turned toward her in confusion. Vincent Hale froze completely. Nina's eyes widened. Marco looked physically ill. And in that same terrible second, the silver chain beneath Zaria's uniform slipped free from her collar. The diamond engagement ring caught. The chandelier light like fire. The diamond ring swung briefly beneath the restaurant lights before settling against Zaria's chest, and the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. Nobody inside Bellarosa Jazz Lounge looked at the crying child anymore. Nobody looked at the shattered glasses on the floor or the terrified guests crouched beneath tables. Every eye locked onto the ring resting against the black uniform of the waitress they had spent the entire evening mocking. Nina Hale's face drained of color first. "No," she whispered under her breath, stepping backward slowly. Vincent stared at Elijah, then at Zaria, then back again as realization spread across his face like ice water. "You have got to be kidding me," one of the men at table 12 muttered weakly. Marco nearly dropped the bottle he was holding behind the bar. Lena covered her mouth with both hands in complete shock. The little boy clung tightly to Zaria's sleeve while she stood frozen in the center of the dining room, her pulse roaring so loudly she could barely hear the chaos outside anymore. Elijah crossed the room toward her without hesitation. Not hurried. Not frantic. Somehow that calm terrified everyone more. Guests instinctively moved aside as he passed. His guards created space around him immediately, eyes scanning every corner while muffled sirens echoed faintly somewhere beyond the rain-soaked streets outside. Elijah stopped directly in front of Zaria. For a second neither of them spoke. He looked at the wine stain soaking through her uniform. The trembling child clutching her arm. The engagement ring finally exposed for the world to see. And then his gaze lifted slowly toward Vincent Hale. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. "You embarrassed her," Elijah said quietly. Vincent swallowed hard. "Moretti, listen carefully. We did not know." Elijah's expression never changed. "That is the problem." Nina stepped forward shakily trying to recover some version of composure. "Mr. Moretti, if there has been some misunderstanding, do not speak." Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Nina stopped immediately like the air had been ripped from her lungs. Zaria touched Elijah's wrist softly then, grounding him before the tension inside the room snapped completely apart. "There are families here," she whispered carefully. "Please." Elijah looked down at her for one brief moment, and something inside his face softened again. That quiet tenderness shocked the room almost more than the engagement itself. Because men like Elijah Moretti were rumored to fear nothing. Yet standing beside Zaria Brooks, he looked like a man terrified of losing the only gentle thing left in his world. Another loud sound echoed from outside the restaurant followed by hurried footsteps near the entrance. One of Elijah's guards approached quickly. "The street is secure," he reported. But Hale's convoy was followed. Vincent cursed under his breath. Elijah never looked away from him. "You brought danger into a public restaurant full of civilians. You think I planned this?" Vincent snapped back, panic finally cracking through his polished image. "Somebody inside my operation sold information." Elijah's gaze shifted coldly toward the men seated around Vincent's table. Nobody met his eyes. Fear spread visibly now. One man loosened his tie with shaking fingers. Another quietly slid his phone beneath the table like he hoped invisibility could still save him. But Elijah noticed everything. He always did. "Interesting," he said softly. "Loyalty seems very fragile tonight." Zaria felt the little boy trembling beside her and knelt carefully despite the ache spreading through her shoulder from earlier impact during the panic near the hallway. "Hey," she whispered gently to him. "Look at me. You are safe now." The child nodded tearfully. Elijah watched her comfort the frightened boy in the middle of chaos, and for one dangerous second emotion crossed his face openly. Not weakness. Something deeper. Something protective enough to destroy cities. Vincent saw it too. And that was when true fear finally entered his eyes. Because he understood at last that this was no longer about business alliances or damaged pride. The woman his table mocked all evening was the one person capable of turning Elijah Moretti merciful or monstrous depending on how the night ended. And everyone inside Bellarosa suddenly realized the exact same thing. Rain hammered against the windows of Bellarosa while police sirens echoed through Manhattan, but inside the shattered restaurant nobody moved unless Elijah Moretti allowed it. Guards stood at every exit while terrified guests whispered over broken glasses, all eyes fixed on Zaria Brooks, the waitress they had mocked only hours earlier. Elijah guided a frightened child safely back to his parents before returning instantly to her side, his hand resting protectively against her back as if losing sight of her would destroy him. Nina Hale sat pale with shame while Zaria quietly asked the question nobody could answer, would it have mattered if you knew who I was? The silence exposed the truth. They had never disrespected her because of mistakes. They disrespected her because they believed she had no power. When Elijah offered his jacket and softly begged her to come home with him, even hardened men in the room looked stunned watching the feared Moretti reduced to a man terrified of losing one woman's trust. 3 weeks later, Bellarosa reopened under Elijah's ownership, restored more beautifully than before, but the memory of that night still haunted its walls. On reopening night, conversation died the moment Elijah entered beside Zaria, now wearing an emerald dress and a diamond ring beneath the chandeliers where she was once humiliated. Then the entire staff stopped working and gathered silently as Marco revealed a silver plaque renaming Bellarosa's private dining room, Brooks Hall. Tears filled Zaria's eyes while Elijah gently lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles in front of the entire restaurant. Looks like they finally learned, he whispered. And beneath the warm golden lights, the woman they once treated like she was invisible became the only person in the room nobody could look away from.